By noon, the Meadowbrook Estates community text chain was buzzing with unprecedented activity. Dave had shared select images from Karen's portfolio, nothing that invaded neighbors' privacy, but enough to show the extent of her surveillance. The revelation that Karen Willoughby had been systematically photographing their homes, yards, and in some cases, through windows, sent shockwaves through the once quiet subdivision. "She's been documenting my garden gnome collection for months," texted Mrs. Abernathy from number 42. Said they violated the aesthetic continuity clause. "Now I find out she's been taking close-ups from my own rhododendron bushes." Karen sat at her immaculate kitchen island, watching her phone explode with notifications. Her husband Gerald, a quiet man who had long ago learned to exist in the peripheral spaces of his wife's crusades, peeked nervously over his newspaper. Perhaps, he ventured carefully, an apology might smooth things over. Karen's head snapped up. Apologize? For upholding standards? This neighborhood was a prestigious planned community before people like Dave Miller started treating it like green acres. Gerald nodded automatically, then hesitated. "But breaking into his barn, Karen, that's not exactly within HOA jurisdiction." Karen slammed her palm on the granite countertop. "I did not break in. The latch was looser than it appeared." She straightened her silk blouse. "Besides, someone has to maintain property values around here. If Dave files a complaint, the board will back me up." But as the afternoon unfolded, Karen discovered that her certainty was misplaced. Emergency texts to her fellow HOA board members went unanswered. Her calls went to voicemail. Even Pamela Dixon, her most reliable ally in the crusade against colored Christmas lights and unapproved mailbox posts, sent me a brief text. "Need to distance myself until this blows over. Don't call." By 3 o'clock, Sheriff Cooper's patrol car pulled into Karen's driveway. She watched from behind her restoration hardware curtains as Dave Miller stood talking with the officer, showing something on his phone. "This is absurd," she muttered, smoothing her hair and pinching color into her cheeks before opening the door exactly as the sheriff's knuckles met it. "Mrs. Willoughby," Sheriff Cooper said, removing his hat, "I'd like to ask you a few questions about an incident at the Miller property this morning." "Of course, Sheriff," Karen said with practiced cordiality. "Though I'm afraid Mr. Miller has dramatically mischaracterized a routine HOA matter." Sheriff Cooper's weathered face remained neutral. "Ma'am, we have video evidence of you entering a locked structure without permission. Mr. Miller is pressing charges for criminal trespass and invasion of privacy." Karen's smile faltered. "Surely you're not taking the word of a man who keeps livestock in a residential area over mine. Do you know who I am in this community?" "Yes, ma'am, I believe I do," the sheriff replied, his tone suggesting this wasn't necessarily an advantage. "And I know that HOA regulations don't override state law." As Karen tried to process this unexpected challenge to her authority, her phone chimed with an email notification. The sender, Meadowbrook Estates HOA Board. Subject, Emergency Session Results. With growing horror, she opened it to find that in a hastily convened virtual meeting, to which she had not been invited, the board had voted 5-0 to temporarily relieve her of her position pending investigation. "This is a coup," she whispered. Sheriff Cooper cleared his throat. "Mrs. Willoughby, I need you to come down to the station to make a formal statement." Karen's world, so carefully controlled through bylaws and violation notices, was suddenly spinning beyond her grasp. As the sheriff escorted her to his vehicle, neighbors emerged onto their perfectly manicured lawns, watching in stunned silence as Karen Willoughby, who had measured their grass with rulers and fined them for unauthorized bird feeders, was guided into the back of a patrol car. From somewhere down the street, she heard a child's voice. "Mom, is the HOA lady going to jail?" And then, more distressingly, a parent's response that carried clearly in the afternoon air. "We can only hope, honey. We can only hope." Karen's breath caught. No bail meant returning to cell 17B, to mystery meat and grape juice stains, while the neighbors she'd ruled over continued their vindictive celebration of her downfall. "Your Honor," a voice called from the gallery. "May I address the court regarding bail?" Karen turned to see Dave Miller standing, The man whose barn she had entered, whose goats had defiled her shoes, whose complaint had started this nightmare. Judge Barnett frowned. This is irregular, Mr. Miller, Your Honor. David Miller, I'm the primary complainant in the trespassing charge. The judge nodded cautiously. I'll allow it briefly. Dave cleared his throat. While I stand by my complaint and the evidence I've provided, I believe Mrs. Willoughby deserves the opportunity to await trial at home. She has deep ties to our community. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Karen stared at Dave in disbelief. Furthermore, Dave continued, I've spoken with several neighbors who, despite their grievances with Mrs. Willoughby's HOA leadership, don't wish to see her detained indefinitely before trial. Judge Barnett studied Dave, then Karen, then the gallery of neighbors who seemed as surprised by this turn of events as Karen herself. Mr. Miller, am I to understand you're advocating for bail for the woman who trespassed on your property and, according to your statement, has been surveilling you and your neighbors for months? Dave nodded. I am, Your Honor. I believe in justice, not revenge, and I believe Mrs. Willoughby may have learned something valuable from this experience already. The judge considered this, then turned to Karen. Mrs. Willoughby, do you have anything to say? Karen stood, feeling strangely vulnerable without her designer suit and perfect hair. In the gallery, she caught Gerald's eye. For once, he didn't look away first. Your Honor, she began, then stopped, startled by the tremor in her voice. I spent 3 days wondering how my dedication to community standards led me here. I still believe in rules, but perhaps I've been overzealous in their application. She turned slightly toward the gallery. And perhaps I've forgotten that behind every regulation is a human being just trying to live their life. The Meadowbrook County Detention Center wasn't designed with Karen Willoughby in mind. Its institutional gray walls and metal furnishings clashed violently with her personal aesthetic, and the orange jumpsuit they provided after booking seemed deliberately chosen to conflict with her complexion. This is completely unnecessary, Karen insisted as she was processed. I'm a respected community leader with no criminal record. The intake officer didn't look up from her computer. Breaking and entering tends to change that status, ma'am. It was trespassing at worst, Karen corrected automatically. And I'm certain this misunderstanding will be resolved before my hearing. That certainty wavered considerably when Gerald arrived without her requested emergency overnight bag containing her silk pajamas and La Mer skincare products. Instead, he carried paperwork. Bail had been set at $5,000. $5,000? Karen hissed through the visitation partition. For walking into a barn? Gerald shifted uncomfortably. The charges have expanded, he explained, sliding a copy of the complaint toward her. Dave found evidence on your laptop that you've been accessing neighbors' Wi-Fi networks to monitor their internet activity for covenant violations. Karen's face drained of color. That's taking things out of context. I was simply ensuring no one was running unauthorized home businesses. Gerald removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose, a gesture Karen recognized as his prelude to delivering unwelcome news. The district attorney is adding computer fraud charges, and there's a class action forming. 17 neighbors have already signed on, claiming harassment and privacy violations. 17? Karen whispered. Her mind raced through mental files of neighbors she'd written up. The Patels for their unauthorized vegetable garden, the Rodriguezes for their basketball hoop, the Schmidts for holiday decorations displayed 3 days early. She'd always seen herself as the community's protector, its standards bearer. When had she become its villain? There's more, Gerald continued, unable to meet her eyes. The board found financial irregularities in the HOA accounts. What irregularities? Karen demanded, her voice rising. Every penny is accounted for. The landscaping company you hired for the common areas, it's owned by your brother-in-law. And the security system installation that went $30,000 over budget, the contractor was your college roommate. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times before words emerged. Those were the best vendors for the job. The board approved those contracts. Based on your recommendation and the artificial bids you created from non-existent competitors, Gerald finished quietly. Karen, They're saying you've embezzled nearly $200,000 over 3 years. The fluorescent lights suddenly seemed much brighter, the room much smaller. Karen gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "Where's my lawyer?" she managed. Gerald looked down. "Richard says he can't represent you. Conflict of interest. His wife is on the HOA board." For the first time in years, Karen Willoughby found herself without a rulebook to consult, without authority to invoke. The carefully constructed framework of power she built was collapsing like a house of cards. Her first night in the detention center passed in sleepless disbelief. By morning, local news had picked up the story. HOA president's reign of terror ends in criminal charges. The online version featured the video of her in Dave's barn, now with over 50,000 views, and a growing collection of memes focusing on her encounter with the goats. One creative soul had even set the footage to bad to the bone, highlighting the moment when Bandit the goat had snagged her portfolio. It had 17,000 likes by breakfast. When Gerald returned the next day, his expression was even grimmer. "The house has been toilet papered," he reported, "and someone spray-painted goats, 1 Karen, 0 on the driveway. This is harassment." Karen cried. "Where are the community standards now?" Gerald shrugged helplessly. "The interim HOA president says it falls within acceptable Halloween decoration guidelines." Karen stared at her husband of 22 years, as if seeing him for the first time. "And you're allowing this?" His response was so quiet she almost missed it. "Karen, I've been allowing things our entire marriage. Maybe it's time you did too." The terms of Karen's release were stringent. House arrest with an ankle monitor, no internet access, and a restraining order keeping her at least 100 feet from all Meadowbrook Estate's common areas and the homes of neighbors who joined the complaint. In practical terms, this confined her to her house and backyard, a gilded cage that nonetheless felt like freedom after the detention center. As she settled into this new restricted life, Karen discovered Gerald had unexpected depths. The man who had faded into the background of her HOA crusades revealed himself to be diplomatic, kind, and surprisingly resilient. "The Andersons dropped off a casserole," he reported one evening, 2 weeks into her home confinement, "and Mrs. Patel from number 28 brought curry." Karen looked up from the novel she was reading, her first in years, now that committee agendas and violation documentation no longer consumed her evenings. "The same Mrs. Patel I cited for excessive aromatic cooking last summer?" Gerald nodded, a faint smile playing at his lips. "She said something about karma and second chances." Karen set down her book. "Why are they being nice? I wouldn't be nice to me." "People are complicated," Gerald replied, serving the curry onto plates. "Just like you're more than your worst mistakes." This sentiment was tested 3 days later when Karen's attorney informed her that the district attorney was offering a plea deal. The embezzlement charges would be reduced if she agreed to make full restitution to the HOA, and the computer fraud charges would be dropped if she provided a full accounting of her surveillance activities. "What about the trespassing and invasion of privacy?" Karen asked. "Those stand," her attorney explained, "but with no prior record, you're looking at probation and community service rather than jail time." Karen considered the offer while working in her garden, another rediscovery since her electronic house arrest had eliminated most of her usual activities. Her fingers worked the soil as she contemplated her options. The sound of a car door closing brought her attention to the street, where Dave Miller had parked in front of her house. He remained on the sidewalk, respecting the restraining order's boundary. "Your roses need more acidic soil," he called. "Coffee grounds would help." Karen stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "Is this a horticultural visit, or are you here to gloat?" Dave smiled slightly. "Neither. I came to talk about the plea deal. You've been in touch with the DA." Karen didn't bother hiding her surprise. "Several of us have," Dave acknowledged. "The neighborhood has concerns about how this plays out." Karen folded her arms. "I imagine they're disappointed I might avoid jail time." "Actually," Dave replied, "there's a growing consensus that everyone might be better served by resolution than retribution." He explained that while Karen's methods had been invasive and her financial dealings improper, her dedication to the community was never in question. Many neighbors wanted to see reform, not destruction. We've drafted an alternative proposal, Dave continued, placing a folder on the ground at the edge of her property. If you agree to step down permanently from the HOA board, make full restitution, and participate in a community reconciliation process, many of us are willing to ask the DA to reduce charges further. Karen approached the boundary, picking up the folder after Dave stepped back. Inside was not just the proposed legal arrangement, but dozens of signatures, including many people she'd cited for violations over the years. "Why would you do this?" she asked quietly. Dave considered her question seriously. Because Meadowbrook isn't just about property values or pristine lawns. It's about people living together, imperfectly but intentionally. You lost sight of that. But maybe we all did, letting one person interpret community standards instead of creating them together. 6 weeks later, on a crisp autumn morning, Karen Willoughby stood before her neighbors in the community center. The ankle monitor was gone, replaced by the weight of accountability. As part of the reconciliation process, she had agreed to listen openly to how her actions had affected others. For 3 hours, residents spoke their truths about feeling judged, about losing sleep over minor infractions, about children afraid to play outside lest they violate some obscure covenant Karen might be monitoring. When the last speaker finished, Karen approached the microphone, hands trembling slightly. "For years," she began, "I believed I was protecting something valuable, our community standards, our property values, our collective investment. I failed to see that the most valuable part of any community is the sense of belonging, which my actions systematically destroyed." She unveiled the project she'd been working on during her house arrest, a proposed HOA reform that would replace punitive enforcement with collaborative problem-solving, create democratic processes for rule changes, and establish community mediation for disputes. "I cannot undo the surveillance or the harassment," she concluded, "but I can offer a new vision for how we live together, one based on communication rather than control." The room was silent when she finished. Then, from the back, Dave Miller stood. "I move we accept Karen's proposal as a starting point for HOA reform," he said. Slowly, other neighbors rose to second the motion. Not everyone. Some wounds were too fresh, some trust too broken, but enough to begin. As the meeting concluded, Karen found herself face to face with a familiar black and white goat on a leash. Bandit regarded her with the same inscrutable expression he'd worn in the barn that fateful morning. "Dave brings him to all public meetings now," Gerald explained. "Unofficial mascot of the HOA reform movement. They call him the Enforcer." Karen cautiously extended her hand. Bandit sniffed it, then allowed her to scratch behind his ears. "I hear you've applied for a variance to keep chickens," Dave commented. Karen nodded. 6 hens, a modest coop. Gerald's idea, actually. The old HOA president would never have approved that, Dave noted with a hint of mischief. The old HOA president wouldn't have recognized herself with dirt under her fingernails either, Karen replied, as they walked together toward the parking lot. At a careful distance that respected both court orders and newly establishing boundaries, Karen spotted a perfectly manicured lawn with a ruler placed conspicuously at its edge, clearly visible from the sidewalk. The homeowner, Mrs. Abernathy of Garden Gnome fame, offered a small wave. "Is that a joke?" Karen asked uncertainly. Dave chuckled. "The neighborhood has a sense of humor after all. You just never gave us the chance to show it." As Gerald brought the car around, Karen took one last look at the community center, where neighbors continued to discuss the future of Meadowbrook Estates, a future she had helped shape, although not in the way she'd intended. And if, on the drive home, she noticed the Rodriguez family's basketball hoop was still 2 inches higher than regulation, or that the Schmidts had already started putting up Halloween decorations in mid-September, she kept these observations to herself. Some rules, she was learning, mattered far less than the people they were supposed to serve. Bandit the goat, watching from the community center lawn, seemed to agree. Cell 17B of the Meadowbrook County Detention Center offered Karen something she hadn't experienced in years: Silence. No committees to chair, no violations to document, no neighbors to monitor. Just four walls, institutional bedding, and uninterrupted time with her thoughts, a prospect more terrifying than she'd anticipated. On her third day of pre-trial detention, Karen found herself doing something entirely out of character. Listening. Her cellmate, a woman named Darlene serving 30 days for driving with a suspended license, had little in common with Karen's usual social circle. Yet as hours stretched into days, Karen discovered that Darlene's stories about battling the system to keep custody of her children contained wisdom that no Homeowners Association manual ever had. Sometimes, Darlene told her over mystery meat stew in the cafeteria, the rules are just there to keep good people down. You gotta figure out which ones matter and which ones are just bullshit. Karen nearly choked on her reconstituted potatoes. Rules create order, she replied automatically. Without structure, there's chaos. Darlene shrugged. Maybe some chaos ain't so bad. My kids' rooms are disasters, but they're creative as hell. Sometimes the mess is where the magic happens. The conversation lingered in Karen's mind that night as she stared at the ceiling. When had she last allowed for mess in her life? When had Gerald last seen her with unbrushed hair or without makeup? When had their home last felt lived in rather than staged for perpetual inspection? Her bail hearing was scheduled for the following morning. Sleep-deprived and wearing a jumpsuit that had mysteriously acquired a grape juice stain, Karen was escorted to the courtroom to find it unexpectedly packed. The back 3 rows were filled with familiar faces, her neighbors from Meadowbrook Estates. Karen kept her eyes forward, spine rigid. Let them enjoy her humiliation. She would overcome this setback, as she had all obstacles in life, with meticulous planning and controlled emotions. Judge Eleanor Barnett, a stern woman in her 60s, whose reputation for no-nonsense adjudication preceded her, reviewed the charges with alarming efficiency. Mrs. Willoughby, you're facing charges of criminal trespass, invasion of privacy, computer fraud, and embezzlement. How do you plead? Karen's court-appointed attorney, a harried public defender named Mark, who had spent exactly 12 minutes reviewing her case, had advised her to plead not guilty, allowing time to negotiate a plea agreement. Not guilty, Your Honor, Karen said clearly. Judge Barnett nodded, then peered over her reading glasses. I see the district attorney is recommending bail continuation due to the defendant's history of disregarding boundaries and property rights. The piercing scream that echoed across Meadowbrook Estates that Tuesday morning wasn't from a horror movie. It was the authentic sound of Karen Willoughby discovering that designer shoes and fresh goat manure make for an unfortunate combination. These are Louboutins, she shrieked, lifting her right foot with disgust as the herd of Nigerian dwarf goats watched with what appeared to be collective satisfaction from the corner of the barn. What Karen was doing inside Dave Miller's barn at 7:30 am was precisely the question Dave was asking himself as he stood in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, witnessing the president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association hopping on one pristine heel while the other was decidedly less pristine. Good morning, Karen, Dave said calmly, taking a deliberate sip from his mug. Property inspections usually on Fridays, isn't it? Karen's face, already flushed from exertion, turned a deeper shade of crimson. This isn't an official inspection, she snapped, trying to regain her composure. I've received complaints about the smell coming from this petting zoo you call a backyard. Dave leaned against the doorframe. Interesting approach, trespassing instead of calling first. Did the HOA bylaws get updated to permit breaking and entering? The gate was open, Karen huffed, though they both knew it wasn't. The 3 padlocks Dave had installed after Karen's last surprise inspection were evidence enough. So were your eyes when you stepped over my private property? No TORESPASING sign, Dave replied, pulling out his phone. Which means this is all going on record. Karen's eyes widened as she noticed Dave was recording. You can't do that. I have privacy rights. Not on my property you don't, especially when you've broken in, Dave replied, zooming in on Karen's ruined shoe for exhibit evidence. The sheriff might find this interesting. The mention of law enforcement caused a visible change in Karen's demeanor. For 3 years, she had ruled Meadowbrook Estates with clipboard and citation, imposing fines for grass half an inch too tall and trash bins left at the curb 20 minutes past collection. Her power came from rigid enforcement of rules she was now brazenly violating. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, voice trembling slightly. "I'm ensuring compliance with Section 12.3 of the Covenant, Livestock Odor Management. By breaking into my barn at dawn. Try again." Karen attempted to step toward Dave, but froze when she heard a snort behind her. One particular goat, a black and white buckling named Bandit, was eyeing the portfolio clutched in her manicured hand. "Call off your animal," she demanded, pulling the leather folder closer to her chest. "Bandit has a particular taste for fine leather," Dave observed casually. "And technically, this is his house you've invaded. This neighborhood was never zoned for agricultural use," Karen said through gritted teeth. "These animals are a violation, and as HOA president, it's my responsibility to." Her sentence ended in a yelp as Bandit made a quick lunge, snagging the corner of her portfolio. The ensuing tug-of-war sent papers flying, papers that contained not HOA regulations, but photographs. Photographs of everyone's backyards in the neighborhood, with handwritten notes about potential violations Karen hadn't yet reported. "My documentation," she cried, scrambling to collect them as the goats began to see the fluttering papers as an invitation to play. Dave's amused expression faded as he picked up one of the fallen photographs, a high-resolution image clearly taken with a telephoto lens, showing through his kitchen window to where his family had been eating dinner. "Karen," he said, voice dangerously quiet now, "you've crossed more than just a property line here.